then they save a part of their income perhaps, and then they consume the remainder of the income which comes as income to somebody else. That somebody else then consumes a part of that income which comes as income to somebody else, and so on. Therefore, that is what is called the multiplier effect. Now, there is the multiplier effect. You spend 100 rupees on healthcare, that has a multiplier effect. But precisely because of what I was saying a moment ago, if you spend 100 rupees on healthcare, quite apart from the multiplier effects that are generated by this expenditure, a whole lot of people who were, let us say, spending huge amounts in Vedanta and Max and various such things would now no longer be spending that amount there, but would be coming to the public healthcare system. Therefore, purchasing power would be released in their hands. True, there would be a reduction in purchasing power in the hands of the Vedanta employees and the Max employees and so on, but because of the fact that there is a greater amount of profits being made in private healthcare facilities, the reduction in purchasing power in that sector would be less than the increase in purchasing power in the hands of the people who are making the switch from the private to the public healthcare sector. Because of that, there will be a further multiplier effect, because now they have got this money, then they have to spend it, and when they spend, that will generate demand, and exactly the same way, there will be a further multiplier effect. So, a social sector expenditure by the government gives rise to two kinds of multiplier effect. One is the direct multiplier effect, and the other is the indirect multiplier effect, which arises because of the fact that it releases purchasing power in the hands of the people from the more expensive systems that they had been accessing until then. Now, this fact that there are two separate multiplier effects is something which the government doesn't seem to be aware of, because of which, as a matter of fact, expenditure on the social sector would be far more effective in enlarging employment and in enlarging aggregate demand in the economy. As a matter of fact, as you know, unemployment now is really quite acute. Everybody is talking about it, and you find that unemployment estimates in India mean very little, because of the fact that, you go around asking somebody, did you have an hour's employment in the last 1 week? And the person may have had an hour's employment earlier, or had 2 hours employment earlier, person would say yes. Now suppose employment comes down to 1 hour, then the person would still say yes. And therefore unemployment would not have visibly increased, but you would find that as a matter of fact there is an increase in unemployment, because the number of hours that the person worked earlier was greater than the number of hours that the person works now. Therefore, unemployment statistics in India really don't mean very much, but whatever they mean, you find that unemployment, according to the Center for Monitoring Indian Economy, is about 8.3% at the moment, while it was 7.2% in January 2020. So even 7.2 was much higher than the previous years, but even compared to that, there is now much greater unemployment in the economy. Unemployment is a very serious question. Now, therefore, if the government shifted its spending, let's say 100 rupees shifted from spending on public investment, capital expenditure, to 100 rupees being shifted towards social sector expenditures, then you'd find the multiplier effects of the latter would be much greater, and therefore demand would be much greater, and therefore demand for jobs would be much greater, and therefore unemployment would be correspondingly less. There is a second reason why this would be the case, namely that actually when you have investment expenditure in India is such that a substantial part of it in fact leaks out in the form of imports. That you import a lot of capital goods, while you put consumption expenditures in the hands of the people, or you put in, money in the hands of the people, and the amount they consume is something which really has a much less import intensity. Therefore, the multiplier effects of investment would leak out abroad to a much greater extent than the multiplier effects of consumption. Again, I'll tell you a story from my experience. When I used to work in Kerala, there was MGNREGS schemes, so sometimes we would go and visit them. And you ask people that, what do you do with the wage you get? I used to ask them. So they would say, I bought, those grinding stones which with dosa paste is made. And that is produced in a neighboring village. So the point is that it actually generates a much greater level of demand, and therefore a much greater level of employment. If you spend a certain amount of money on the social sector, not only directly but also because it releases purchasing power in the hands of the people, than if you spend the same amount of money in public investment, which is much, it's much more import intensive. Investment is much more import intensive, which is more particularly so under the neoliberal regime, because now people are free to buy, capital goods, whether domestically or from outside, which is why you actually find that even though I mentioned at the beginning that our recovery has been investment-led, you find that in the capital goods sector, domestic capital goods sector that produces capital goods, a recession continues. In other words, even though there is substantial increase in investment expenditure, this does not translate itself into a demand for investment goods produced domestically. So obviously it translates itself into a demand for investment goods produced outside, because of which a fair amount of leakage takes place from this multiplier effect. So for all these reasons, you would have expected that the finance minister's budget should actually have emphasized, as I mentioned, a switching of track, emphasized a shift from capital expenditures to social sector expenditures, which is not only welfare augmenting directly, but also has greater multiplier effects and produces a more sustainable boom for reasons that I mentioned. But when you look at the budget, you actually find just the opposite. That as a matter of fact, you have a continuation of exactly the same kinds of, exactly the same strategy which the government has been following earlier, namely that given the resources in their hands, which are limited, and I'll come to the resource question in a moment, given the resources in their hands which are limited, they have actually starved the social sector in order to generate resources for public investment, for capital expenditures. And this is fundamentally the opposite of the kind of strategy which I was discussing earlier, which in fact stands to reason, which is actually, common sense would tell you that that's a much better strategy because of the greater multiplier effects and employment generating effects, apart from the fact that it's a more sustainable strategy and more of welfare augmenting. So, I suppose most of you are aware of the figures of the budget. I don't have to really kind of load my talk with figures about the budget, but just one or two I'd like to mention. One, of course, as everybody has talked about, is the MGNREGS. It is absolutely and utterly shocking that the MGNREGS outlay is only 60,000 crores. Everybody knows the significance of MGNREGS during the period of the lockdown when people were thrown out of their jobs, thrown out of their habitats, many of them started trekking back to their villages. And of course, that in itself was painful enough, but when they did trek back to their villages, the only way that they could earn a living was through MDNREGS. So there was a huge increase in the MDNREGS, in the demand for work under MDNREGS, and the government was forced to raise the total outlay for MDNREGS that year to 112,000 crores. That is in 2020-21. In the subsequent years, it came down to 98,000 crores. Last year, the government had actually brought it down to 72,000 crores, but it says 73,000 crores, but it actually was forced to spend 89,000 crores, which was the outlay, because obviously when there's unemployment, there's distress, MDNREGS is the only thing that is available to most people to really go back to. Because of which last year, or rather I should say, when I say last year, I mean 2022-23, the current year, except that is last from the point of view of the budget year. So in 2022-23, according to the revised estimates, you actually find that MDNREGS expenditure by the government would be 89,000 crores. But despite this, for 2023-24, the outlay earmarked has been only 60,000 crores. 60,000 crores was the outlay which was earmarked 10-15 years ago, when Chidambaram used to be the finance minister. That was the outlay which was earmarked, 60,000 crores, and now we are back to that. Other changes are taking place, one of which is that now there is an insistence that proof of having worked on MDNREGS would have to be provided in the form of a photograph which has to be uploaded. That everybody working has to be photographed and the photograph has to be uploaded. Now, in large parts of rural India, you really do not have internet connectivity. And if you don't have internet connectivity, then this uploading becomes very difficult, because of which you actually would find that people who would have no proof to show that they actually were working on an MDNREGS. Therefore, there will be no wages payment for them, because of which there would be a discouraged worker effect, and therefore people would in fact would even stop appearing. Why should you work if you're not getting any money for it? Therefore, these are means of really winding up the MDNREGS, because my fear is that there is a prejudice on the part of this government, which was expressed quite openly by Mr. Modi, the Prime Minister, before he became Prime Minister, that MDNREGS was just a waste of money, and therefore that prejudice is now going to be translated into a serious effort to wind up the MDNREGS. The insistence on digital proof is one expression of that, and of course the reduction in the outlay is another expression of that. Now obviously, when this is put to the government, they will say, oh well, no, if more people come to work, we shall make more money available. But the point is, because of the small allocation, the delays which would be entailed in actually making more money available is something that would discourage people from appearing itself in the MDNREGS. In other words, you'd find that wage arrears would build up, and if wage arrears build up, then of course the effort would be, there'll be reluctance on the part of the people who are working if wages are not being paid in time. And many would not even know if they're going to be paid wages. So this attack on MDNREGS is really quite shocking. It was one significant measure of relief to the people which had been provided. In fact, I would say the most significant measure of relief to the people which had been provided in post-independence India. And the point is that, that winding it winding up the NREGS, which this budget seems to suggest is something which would be a real criminal offense. When it comes to other sectors, rural development, the outlay is less in nominal terms. In sectors like education and health, there is some increase in nominal outlays, but on the other hand, when you take it adjusted for inflation, in real terms, the outlays are not going to be any higher compared to what they were in the revised estimates of 2022-23. So down the line, the social sector expenditure has actually been cut in some areas in nominal terms, in other areas in real terms. And this is, on the other hand, as we know, there is an increase in capital expenditure, which is from 7.5 lakh crores to 10 lakh crores, the government's own direct capital expenditures, and resources transferred to the states for augmenting their capital expenditures. If you take that into account, there's a rise from 10 lakh crores to 13 lakh crores. We're almost a 30% increase in capital expenditures. But on the other hand, there is hardly any increase, and in many cases, significant cuts in social sector outlays. Similarly, for instance, you find that there is no increase in food subsidy, even though the government is very proudly proclaiming that 5 kilos of grains they're going to make available per month to the 5 kilos they are going to make available free per month, which was a measure introduced during the COVID period, but that measure has been continuing. And this is something which has generally been welcomed by everybody. To about 80 crore people in the country get 5 kilos of grain free per month. But on the other hand, if you do not have an increase in food subsidy, then that would basically mean that the money that is spent on this would probably come out from some other segment of the poor people who are dependent upon the kind of public distribution system. So how the government is going to square its calculations is something which remains a mystery. But on the other hand, food subsidy has not been augmented, in fact is marginally cut in real terms. So the social sector expenditures, which, as I have been arguing, are so central to reviving the economy, have actually been cut, and in other cases kept where they were in real terms. But on the other hand, there's a rise in capital expenditures. Problem with the rise in capital expenditures, as I said, is that a lot of it leaks out abroad and therefore doesn't generate the kind of multiplier effects that you would like to do. And secondly, there is a second reason why capital expenditure is not as effective in generating multiplier effects. You see, suppose you spend 100 rupees in public investment, you buy investment goods. These investment goods are largely produced in the factory sector, in the large-scale production sector. And particularly if you are talking about infrastructure investment, a lot of the infrastructure investment goods are produced in the factory sector. In those sectors, per unit value of output, the share of profits is larger than the medium and small enterprise sector. Okay. Since more of profits are saved, you find that therefore the amount of purchasing power that would leak out in the form of savings is much greater from the public investment expenditure than it would be if, for instance, you actually spent it on avenues which generated demand in the MSME sector. I never make myself clear. So that's the second reason. Apart from the import leakage, the second reason why, because of the fact that more purchasing power would leak out through a greater saving per unit of output in the sectors whose output would increase because of public investment, you find that really the multiplier effect would be limited. Altogether, therefore, this is something, this budget really does not address the basic issues of the economy. There is a second point. Not only is it the composition of the budget, so far I've been talking on the composition of the budget, but when you actually look at the total expenditure of the government, the whole idea is that the economy is moving into a recession. The world economy is moving into a recession as a way of counteracting inflation. The only way that in a capitalist economy you can counteract inflation is by creating unemployment. And this is something which has always been the case, and this is exactly the panacea that is being tried out now. Therefore, all over the world there is an effort to create unemployment via a recession as an anti-inflationary measure. And since that is something which is going to affect the Indian economy as well, if interest rates rise elsewhere for generating recession, then the Indian economy too would be forced to raise the interest rate. So the economy would be moving into a recession. Now, one way of combating this recession is by raising the level of government expenditure. In real terms, the level of government expenditure should be increasing as an anti-recessionary measure. And if that is the case, then you'll find that the economy would actually be boosted. But of course, inflation can be taken care of through direct price control or through enlarging the public distribution system and so on, which a typical capitalist economy would not do. A typical capitalist economy doesn't have a public distribution system. You don't have a public distribution system in Britain or in Germany and so on. And therefore, given the fact that we have a PDS, a fairly widespread PDS, you find that a far more effective way for the government to manage inflation is to enlarge the public distribution system, enlarge its coverage, and also to enlarge the number of items which are sold under the public distribution system. We know, for instance, that at the moment, that one of the areas in which inflation is quite sharp is in fact in the case of food items, wheat, pulses, edible oils. Now these are commodities. Wheat in any case is distributed through the PDS. These are commodities which can all be distributed through the PDS in order to insulate people from the effect of inflation. And we don't have to generate a recession for combating inflation like advanced capitalist economies do. And that being the case, we could actually prevent a recession by enlarging government expenditure and, of course, by enlarging the multiplier effects of the government expenditure by spending more on the social sector. All right, you haven't done the latter, but have you done the former? And it turns out that even that is not done, because in nominal terms, you find that the rise in the government's total expenditure is about is less than 8%. Less than 8%. The assumption behind the budget is that GDP in nominal terms is to rise by 10.5% in 2023-24. Therefore, government expenditure, even as a proportion of GDP, far from rising, is actually budgeted to fall. Now that, instead of being a counter-recessionary measure, is in fact a recessionary measure. And consequently, what we have is the absence, just put the two facts together. On the one hand, expenditure is not going to rise even as much as the GDP is expected to rise, and on the other hand, the composition of the expenditure is such that a great deal of it would leak out abroad, a great deal of it would leak out in the form of savings, and it would not improve the people's conditions, not release any purchasing power on the side in the hands of the people. Therefore, the budget is actually, far from combating recession, is itself recessionary. And what is more, you see this leakage of the multiplier effects is something which is very serious at the present moment. It's serious because of the fact that, that you may have seen that at the moment the current account deficit is really quite significant. I mean that the world economy, because of the recession that it is moving into, our exports are falling. Our exports are not rising rapidly enough, while our imports are rising, because this is precisely the time when every other country wants to dump its goods in the Indian market. And we don't have a protectionist policy, and therefore our imports are rising. And in this situation, in fact, for the latest period we have data for, the current account deficit is as much as 4% of GDP, which is really double what it normally is. Normally about 2% of GDP is the current account deficit. Now you're having 4% of GDP for the latest period. I'm not saying for the year as a whole, which is 4% of GDP. Now, this is going to create a big problem of financing. In India, we have always financed the current account deficit on the balance of payments by getting hold of financial inflows. In other words, if India is a safe haven for financial inflows, then no matter what the other implications of financial inflows may be, they enable us to finance our current account deficit. As a matter of fact, in the past, because of the inflow of funds into the country, not only have we been able to finance our current account deficit, but we have actually built up huge reserves. The India's foreign exchange reserves are built not because we export more than we import. It's built because of the fact that we are borrowing from the financial, FIIs, foreign institutional investors, and keeping it in the form of reserves. Okay, so we have built up huge reserves because we actually got more inflows than was needed for meeting the current account deficit. Therefore, till now we have not had a problem, even though we have always had a deficit. But we have always had a deficit. Now, not only do we have a sharp depreciation in the value of the rupee, it's now more than 80 rupees to a dollar, but despite that, our current account deficit is increasing. Now, typically, when you have a depreciation in the value of the rupee, that should be helping us by reducing current account deficit. Why? Because of the fact that our exports become cheaper abroad, and foreign goods become more expensive domestically in rupee terms. Therefore, exchange rate depreciation is supposed to be a means of curing a current account deficit. But instead, now what we have is that we actually have a sharp drop in the value of the rupee, and yet the current account deficit is widening. Now, that being the case, a budget that actually holds the threat of a larger imports coming into the economy in the form of capital goods and so on. In other words, instead of shifting the pattern of demand in a direction where more domestic goods would be demanded, if we retain a pattern of demand where more imported goods are demanded, then that's the last thing we should be doing in a situation like this. And therefore, even from that point of view, from the balance of payments point of view, the budget really leaves a lot, is really, utterly unwise, inadvisable, because it does nothing as far as our foreign exchange front is concerned. On the contrary, when we are going to have this kind of a situation, very quickly you can actually get into a crisis. Sri Lanka got into a crisis very quickly. Pakistan is getting into a crisis. Even Bangladesh, which actually had a fairly robust economy some time ago, not enviable, but nonetheless robust. It's not enviable because it was really based on sweated labor of housewives who actually produce all these garments and so on. That's not what I would really hail as a big example of development, but nonetheless it appeared at least stable. If Bangladesh is getting into a problem, in India, in the face of the depreciation of the rupee by at least 8 to 10%, the Reserve Bank of India spent $100 billion of our foreign exchange reserves to stabilize the rupee without success, because the rupee did after all fall. So very quickly these things can actually disappear. Our foreign exchange reserves can disappear. So in a situation like that, the government would be forced, or the Reserve Bank would be forced to raise the interest rates, because one way in which you would have to attract finance is by offering higher returns, and therefore you would be forced to raise the interest rate, which would be recessionary. And therefore, anticipating such a recessionary effect, the government's budget should actually have produced some counter-recessionary measures, but as I was arguing, this is exactly the opposite of what the government's budget has done. I have spoken a lot. The last point I'd like to make is the following: that you see that let us take this case of the Adanis, okay, because which is very much in the news. You see, what is quite remarkable is that the kind of nexus that you could build between a politician and a businessman, which was possible in an economy that is insulated from the rest of the world, is no longer possible in an economy that is heavily dependent on foreign financial influence. Not because foreign financiers are models of rectitude, not because they are themselves very moral and ethical, but because of the fact that there is a rivalry on. I mean, there is a competition on in the world economy between different blocks of capital. And that being the case, you cannot do what you like as you could in an economy that was insulated. That's why you have this firm, Hindenburg, saying all this about the Adanis. I mean, this is a part of the game of capitalism. The game of capitalism is to pull the other fellow down, and therefore you can create space for yourself. So that is, it's a world of cutthroat competition. Now, in this world of cutthroat competition, it becomes very difficult for the government not to institute an inquiry. I mean, it may choose not to, but in that case, getting foreign finance to come and finance the current account deficit becomes that much more difficult. Okay, already there are editorials and so on, articles in newspapers like Financial Times saying, let us see what the government of India does. In other words, finance, globalized finance is waiting to see what the government of India does. So if you don't institute an inquiry, or if you institute a slot machine inquiry where you actually get the result that you wanted, namely that the Adanis are lily white and pure, in that case it lacks credibility in the eyes of globalized finance. And that being the case, this is a manifestation of the contradiction, which is the typical contradiction of our era between globalized capital on the one hand and the nation state on the other hand. In other words, neoliberalism really implies that you cannot just do things unless you insulate yourself from the world economy. You cannot just do this kind of cronyism to your heart's content. There have to be some limits to it, and these limits are now being imposed upon the government by foreign competitors, and if we ignore those limits, then the inflow of finance to sustain our balance of payments would become even more difficult. I think I better stop there. Thank you very much.